I've been hurt, so I want you to hurt and feel guilty about what you've done to me.
Hey everyone, welcome to the BPD Bunch. I'm your host Xannie, and today I am here with Céline and Georgette. Where in the world is everyone coming from today?
I am coming from Surrey in England.
And I am actually coming from California in the United States today, my home state.
I'm coming from New Mexico in the United States. Today we are going to be diving deep into BPD and revenge. So BPD and feelings of vindictiveness or holding a grudge. If this or other BPD related topics interest you, please make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications so you do not miss anything. To get us started, I want to know, are you the type to hold a grudge, and how do you define that?
So for me, I define it more in terms of the splitting type symptom of BPD. That's the way I sort of relate to the idea of a grudge most. I think when I hear the word grudge, I feel like I want to say I don't hold grudges, but I think I just maybe define them slightly differently, because I definitely do get the feeling sometimes that I don't wish the other person well. I find it hard to accept that I'm probably holding a grudge, but I guess I think I just feel like I'm splitting on them, and I go from feeling one way about them to feeling another for probably quite a long time, although I can switch back.
I'm glad you brought up that the splitting, Celine, because when I was thinking about this question, I wanted to say, of course, I'm not the type to hold a grudge. I only wish everyone well. But I like that you brought up splitting because I think that's probably a little bit more of what happens. And the splitting, I feel like it comes from this place of like protection of yourself. And I do think that that's more what happens is that I split on a person and I hold on to that split at that thinking of them as like, nope, don't want anything to do with them. I am done. That's it. And I don't know that I actively hold on to like wishing them ill because I don't like to put that kind of like energy out into the universe because I feel like it kind of just comes back. So it's not like I wish them ill. It's just more like I am done. That is it. And I will hold on to that. But I don't, yeah, I do think it's more in terms of splitting. I take slights really personally. And it cuts me to like the core. And so I feel so hurt that my gut reaction is like wanting to hurt back. But I also feel like that passes very quickly. And then I start to not necessarily, like, I don't want to hurt them, but I definitely want to keep that block between us.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't know if I'm so much the type to hold a grudge anymore, but I remember when I was in middle school, this kid threw a ball and hit my brother in the face, and he started crying. And I remember that kid's name to this day. And I had negative feelings about him all through high school and into my 20s because of this one time he made my brother cry. And I held on to it almost in like a perverted sense of loyalty to my grudge in a way. It was like, this guy shall not be forgiven. Even when I didn't really feel that emotional about it anymore, my brain was like, you must not let this go. And I don't do that so much anymore. Like, I definitely remember things and use those as a way to be cautious. But certainly I don't think I hold on to it in the same way that I used to. And I know it's sort of a silly kid example from middle school, but I like that example because I think even into my 20s, I still had that kind of thing where it was like a loyalty to the feeling of the grudge. I couldn't let it go because I don't know, somehow if I let it go, then who's holding on to this? Who's holding it over the person's head for the horrible thing that they did, right? Yeah. It's so funny to think back to that.
It almost sounds like you want the person to stay accountable,
Yeah.
and you feel like
Yeah.
you need to hold that person accountable to that action. Yeah, I think it's like a protective thing, and that holding the person to account, and like that act was so bad that you need to have some sort of accountability for it, and I'm going to hold that accountability.
Yeah, I think the things that have really been more long lasting in terms of like the BPD struggle have been sort of what you two talked about, the splitting. A lot of it is what I would consider more vindictiveness in the moment, where I feel hurt and my immediate reaction is just to hurt you back. Like, I want you to
Yeah.
feel the way that I feel.
Yeah.
And so, whatever you've done, I'm going to, and it would always happen with almost without thinking. It's just like, all right, here you go. Bam. You've been served the pain that you served to me.
This is like interesting because I started when I was doing my notes for this episode, I started thinking about it. And I think, well, this is another example of like how BPD is a continuation of normal to the extreme. I think this is a really normal, like human thing, right? The eye for the eye, the you hurt me, you get punished with hurt. That it's a very, I think everybody has these reactions.
I think you bring up a really good point, and this is where the nuance of all of this really matters. Like, it's not the fact that we have had these reactions, but at least for me, when I look back on my life, a lot of it was the extremity and the speed at which, like, somebody would do something and I would immediately go for the jugular, even if it was a relatively minor thing. I would interpret something as a criticism and then all bets are off, and I think that's where the line between BPD and average behavior is that, somebody could be asking me what, like, I think in high school, my best friend would ask me if I'd done my homework, and my immediate thought was she assumed I hadn't done it, and therefore she thought lesser of me, and so I would just jump to biting her head off. Like, how dare you? How dare you have this thought, right? And it was just so extreme, so fast.
Yeah. That immediate personalization of something that was really not meant to be taken so personally. And you're like, it's cutting you to the core and you're like going to get back,
Yeah. All right. So we kind of talked about this a little bit, but what specific situations or feelings tend to provoke thoughts of revenge or vindictiveness for you?
I think the key to, for me, which probably you guys will relate to, is rejection and criticism. I very much relate to the word revenge and vindictiveness. I think I relate less to the word grudge. And I think we've sort of talked about it a little bit already, but that's to do with the extreme and speed of which I feel those negative feelings in response to being criticized. Typically, it may not even be a real criticism. It may be something that I think the person is saying. Like Xannie used the example of your best friend, asking you about homework, seemingly a neutral question, but in your mind, you read between the lines that probably aren't even there. So, if I perceive it as a criticism or if it's negative feedback about me, I'll immediately go on the defensive and then also try and hurt them in the process. And I think I forget who I'm talking to, because usually it's those who are closest to me that I feel able to just say whatever to, and then you hurt the ones you love the most, as they say, and yeah, I always feel pretty bad afterwards.
I feel like it's situations in which I feel hurt by somebody's behavior or words, or what they've said has made me feel embarrassed or ashamed. And I think that is definitely associated with things that I'm perceiving as a criticism, I just feel like things so easily cut me to the core. It's like again, like the eye for the eye, like you've hurt me, I'm going to hurt you. So if I feel bad about myself, if I feel ashamed, I think I'm more likely to hold on to like what we're calling a grudge, but I think it's also that feeling of revenge, of vindictiveness. I almost feel like I deserve to have that because I was so hurt that it's like this is the balance of the universe, right?
Yeah, I would second and third everything that's been said so far. I think the only thing that I can really add to it is that I think, yes, it's criticism, but a lot of the times it's things that I'm already insecure about are the things that I tend to, like, I'm looking for criticism to confirm my insecurities in a way. So if like things that I'm pretty confident and secure in, I'm much less likely to have that sense that I'm being attacked. Like I was saying with the homework example, I think the reason why I took that so personally and why I was so immediately vindictive was because I did struggle to get my homework done on time. I was not the kind of person who had things done in advance. So when I was asked that question, I immediately was put on the defense because it was a struggle. And so I think that's been kind of illuminating to realize, oh, if I'm having a feeling like I want to lash back out at somebody, it's probably a sign that this is something I'm insecure about.
Definitely relate to that, as well as the feeling of shame, actually, when I break it down and think about why I take criticism as I do and why I feel like the need to lash out. I think actually the criticism is the trigger, but the feeling and emotion inside of me is shame, and I really struggle with shame a lot.
Yeah, that shame feeling just really triggers this wanting to protect yourself by like, well, here's my armor and here's my weapon and I'm going to get you. The first memory I have of this being like very conscious was a kid that I grew up with, my friend Pete. He must have done something to embarrass me. He did something that like I didn't like. And I wrote in my journal that I wanted to send him my dirty underwear. I was like mad and I'm going to send Pete my dirty underwear. And my mom found my journal and was horrified. I was too young. I mean, I was old enough to write, but I was too young to really explain like why I wanted to send to my friend my dirty underwear. But it was because it was the worst thing that I could think of doing at the time. Like, you're getting dirty underwear for hurting me. So that was like the first time I had like a conscious like realization that I had this, I guess, trait. I don't know. But then when I started thinking about going even farther back, I remember that and I don't know if this is necessarily revenge, but I remember that when my brothers were born, I was 3. And my mom had little twins, my little brothers, and I had a ongoing fantasy in my head. This is so terrible. I had this fantasy in my head of being on a farm and putting on a big pair of boots, like work boots, and going around and stomping baby chicks. And yes, baby chicks are so cute, right? But I remember having this repeating, like I guess a fantasy of going around and just stomping these baby chicks. And it was like later in my life when it came back to me and I realized, wow, you were really upset about having baby brothers. And instead of thinking about hurting the baby brothers, I somehow like had this thing where I was stomping baby chicks in like huge work boots. So I don't know if that's like a vengeful, vindictive thing. Like,
Yeah, I
but
think so.
anyway.
That's really
Yeah.
interesting.
I just want to say that I would not stomp a baby chick either. I want to put that up. I was very young. I was like 3.
That's almost why having having an imagination as a human is kind of a double-edged sword, for sure. But I do think that's one of the reasons why an imagination can be helpful to work through some of those thoughts in a way that's not actually hurting anybody, right? Like,
yeah.
Most people may not be willing to admit this, but most people probably have had a violent thought about somebody when they were really angry, right? So I do think that the line between thought and action is an important one to draw, just to be clear. Yeah.
You were saying that you think that most people have had like a violent thought, and that made me think like, wait a second, I thought that was totally normal. And that was part of me realizing like, oh, this is BPD, this is not normal. It's almost like a check. Like, don't most people have, don't you think, do most people have those?
Again, it comes down to like intensity, duration, and like how appropriate it is for the situation, right? Like, I think a lot of people, if they're cut off in traffic, they might imagine in that moment of rage, might imagine like ramming into the person in front of them because they're so angry about it. Like, not everyone would have that specific thought, but I think it's not unreasonable to assume that there are lots of people who might have the thought for a split second. It's more like if they're still holding on to it days later, it's like a recurring thought, or it's something that they revisit, or if it's something that's maybe inappropriate to the situation. Like with the homework example, my friend asked me if I'd done my homework, and I immediately like imagined punching her in the face and yeeting her across the room. Like that would be a pretty strong like reaction, right?
Yeah.
So I think there is some amount of like what makes it dysfunctional is the proportion, the duration, and those kinds of things. And especially as a child, right? To have had it a couple of times, like when you're maybe envious that you have new brothers that are getting all the attention, maybe that makes sense. But if it feels more like it was an intrusive thought that you were having on a regular basis, that's where you're like, I don't know. Like, that's where it brings into question. And I can't say for sure, because the thing is, like, we say, oh, there's a line, but it's more like it's a gradient. It's super blurry. It's hard to know for sure at which point it switches from one to the other. That's part of why we have this conversation, right? Because it's like, how do you know? I don't know.
I have a similar example in terms of having violent and extreme thoughts as a child against someone that I loved and would be expected to love. I see it as dysfunctional because of the extremeness of the violence and the age that I was and who the person I was having the thought about. And I would say that it wasn't just like an intrusive thought, it was almost like a fantasy. And I think in terms of looking at the way we defend ourselves as a protective measure, I think the fantasy was an escape for me. And it took me a really long time to admit this. The first time I told my therapist, I felt awful about it. And the reaction that he gave me was like, well, for you, that was normal. That's what the situation you were in. You were trying to keep yourself safe. And what it was is I was growing up with my dad who, has his own troubles. And I found it really difficult to explain why I was struggling in that household. And so I would have these fantasies about creeping up on him at night and killing him in his sleep. And I even went as far one day to ask my dad what he would do if I tried to kill him in his sleep. And he said he would wake up and kill me back before I had the chance to kill him. And I think that kind of put an end to the fantasy because it brought it into real life. And he was not really particularly violent with me. So like that kind of response was like, oh, well, obviously he's going to defend himself if he's being attacked. I need to maybe think of less extreme ways to release the tension and the confusion I was feeling and the distress than to automatically go straight to like, well, the best way for me to fix this problem is just kill that person. And obviously I've never been violent with anyone. I would never act on that. But I definitely relate to sort of having these extreme violent thoughts as a child. And then as an adult being like, oh, I just thought it was normal because it's not something you talk about when you're that age, is it?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting.
Yeah.
I have a story that I think kind of wraps this up pretty well, which is that, like, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago. So I was still in my recovery journey and not really at a more stable state as I am now. And I was swimming in the pool at the gym. And I was doing this thing where I spend a lot of time underwater trying to hold my breath. So I'm not actually sure if the person who joined my lane knew that I was there or not, but someone joined my lane without asking me first. And I was so angry. And I kept imagining, like, kicking her as we passed each other. And there was one moment where there are those, like, floating dividers in the pool. And I accidentally, just as I was swimming, I wasn't trying to kick anybody, but I accidentally kicked the floating divider. And for a second, I thought I had actually kicked her. And I felt so horrible immediately. I looked around and I got out of the water and I was like, oh, okay. I didn't actually, she's like way on the other end. I didn't actually hurt her. But I do think that just goes to show, like, there is a divide often between thoughts and actions. And, I could instantly tell by my reaction that I never would have intentionally done that, even had that been an option. So now on the flip side, for our next question, let's talk about, have you ever acted on vengeful feelings? And if so, what were the outcomes? How did you feel afterwards?
I once got cut off in traffic by a person, and maybe I was in a bad mood, but I got cut off in traffic and I flew into a rage so much that we both pulled over on the side of the road. And I was like, if I had a baseball bat in the car, I'd be in jail right now. I was so enraged. I didn't like the car the person was driving. I was like, that person's a snob. And then they cut me off in traffic and we pulled over on the side of the road. And I got out of my car. I was in such a rage. And like I said, this is why I don't have weapons. If I had like something in my car that I could have like broken her car window with, I would have just chucked it and driven off. And I think about it now and I'm like, that was such an extreme reaction of like, I'm going to get this woman back and teach her a lesson about cutting me off in traffic and driving a fancy car. And I'm going to get her. And luckily, we both got out of the car. We started like yelling at each other. And then something must have clicked where I was like, what are you doing? Get back in your car. Got back in my car, drove off. And the whole way to where I was on my way to work, I was like, just fantasizing about like, I should have broken that A's window. I should have taught her a lesson. And then I was thinking to myself, like, oh my God, what is wrong with you?
I have a couple of examples. I'm going to start with the less extreme one because I think it's funny how in my backward BPD emotional mind, I thought I was getting back at the person when really the revenge I was taking was really just coming out on myself. So I was living in my mum's house and I moved in with her as an adult when I stopped living with my dad. So I didn't grow up with her. So I felt like I was sort of living in her husband's house, and I have a little sister as well. And we got this puppy and it really sadly died at 6 months. So I had this picture of the puppy up in my room. And my little sister, who was a child, like maybe 8 or 9, said that her looking at the picture made her feel sad and she wanted me to take it down. So she told my mom and my mom told me that they wanted me to take this picture down. And I felt it was so unfair because, I felt like I was being told that I couldn't feel or I couldn't grieve the way I wanted to grieve. And so what I did was I said to my mom, well, that's fine. I'm just a guest in your house. And I went off on like a long rant about that. And I took all my photos down and all these little note cards I had up with positive affirmations. And I ripped them all off the wall, ripping the paint on it as well. And I had this little sign on my door that my sister had made me. I took that off too, and it was really bare. And I was like, well, I'll just live in this prison then, and I'll just move out as soon as I can. So really the only person I was getting back at was me, because it was my living space. It was my bedroom. So when I thought of that scenario, I wanted to make my mum feel bad. The desire for revenge was, again, as we sort of said, I've been hurt, so I want you to hurt and feel guilty about what you've done to me. But really, the only person who was really upset was me. So my mom just waited for me to calm down and then was like, stop being ridiculous, put your pictures back up. And after like 2 weeks of sitting in a plain room, I was like, I'm just going to put my pictures back up. So that was one example. The other more extreme example, which is probably one of the things I'm most ashamed about in my life, but I think it really brings this issue to life in terms of how I really struggle with it. And it's definitely a part of my BPD that I really don't like about myself, and has definitely, I've learned to manage as I've got older. So when I was a teenager, so I was probably about 14, I was texting this boy that I liked, and he liked me and I liked him, and we used to text all the time. And then suddenly one day he just told me that we weren't even like boyfriend and girlfriend or together or anything, but he just said that he wasn't interested in pursuing anything, and probably said something like we shouldn't text anymore, but it was very much out of the blue and I wasn't expecting it. And I think because I was struggling with my mental health at the time, and these are thoughts that I was having at the time anyway, I then jumped straight to thinking, well, I want him to feel bad and I want him to know how much he's hurt me and to feel really, really bad about this. So what I'm going to pretend to do is to take my own life, and then I'm going to make sure all my friends at school post on my social media RIP messages. God, I'm so embarrassed about this. And then he's going to feel so bad, he's going to text me, and then don't know what the end thought or the end goal was there, but that was as far as I got in my big grand planning scheme of revenge. And when I look back, I'm really not sure why any of my friends went along with this. I even asked people like who were in other classes in my year who I wasn't even that close with to do it, so it looked really realistic, which they did. And anyway, so I executed the plan, and then he texts me on my phone like a message to my parents like, I'm really sorry, like feeling responsible. So my plan worked, and then what? I felt really bad that I made someone feel really upset. And when I told him that it wasn't true, he then didn't want to speak to me, obviously, and all his friends then thought I was some horrible person, which I was, and we didn't speak for years. But the upside of this story is I learnt from my ways, I did apologise, and we're still friends to this day. So we've been friends for a really long time. We're in our 30s now. So, and he now looks back on it sort of like, well, you know, you weren't well and you were a kid. But I still get so embarrassed about this story, and I just can't believe I would ever do that to someone. But in my mind at the time, that's what I felt like I needed to do, and I went about it. You know, I executed a whole plan. It wasn't even like an intrusive thought, and I just lashed it out. So yeah, it's definitely a part of me that I really don't like, and something that I really actively work on.
I like that you shared that, because I feel like when we share things that we feel like embarrassment or shame about, like I feel like that can really help other people who might be struggling with these things. So I
Yeah.
just want to like say, hey, for your bravery for sharing that. And you're such a kid, you know?
Thank you.
I can totally relate. Just like you, I have two examples that differ in extremity, and one of them is very similar actually to the story that you just told. Except that I was 20, so I don't have as much of an excuse as you. So the lesser example for me is when I was in high school, I had an eating disorder. And one of the things that I would sometimes do was, especially in response to my parents, if my parents said something to me that I didn't like, I would go secretly engage in eating disorder behavior as a way to get back at them. But sort of like you, Celine, in your room making that mess, right? The only person I really was hurting was me. But in my mind, I was like, I'm going to just keep hurting myself and I'll show you. Right. And I look back on it now, and I mean, it's kind of funny in the sense that like I was really hurting myself the most. But it is a little bit twisted that a lot of my vengeance or vindictive behaviors come from this place of like, I'm going to use your love for me against you.
Mm,
I'm going to use the
yeah.
fact that you care about me to hurt you because I'm going to hurt myself and that's going to hurt you. And I think it's such a messed up way of dealing with these things. And that's why I also feel a great deal of shame, not only about that, but my other example, which I've mentioned this a couple of times on the show before, but I'm going to be a little bit more blunt about what was the degree of this. So I was in an on again, off again relationship. And right after one of the breakups, I have framed this as self-harm, but it was really an attempt to end my own life. I filmed myself in the process of attempting to end my own life. I sent it to my favorite person, who was at that moment my ex, and I said, if I die, it is your fault. And that's the worst thing I think I've ever done to someone. Because again, it was using their care for me against them. Even though they had said, I don't love you anymore, it's over, I was still like, I'm going to use the fact that you care about me against you, and even if I die, you will never be able to escape me. It was a desperate attempt to immortalize myself in their mind and make it impossible for them, even though rationally they would know that I had done this to myself and it was ultimately on me. They would always feel responsible. And if I couldn't get them to love me, I wanted them to feel responsible for me forever. And it was deeply traumatizing. Our relationship never did recover. I think that is the single biggest example that I have of that.
I've definitely behaved in similar ways during breakups. I think probably breakups and sort of the rejection feeling is where my sense of revenge and vindictiveness comes out the worst. And well, for me, because it's a big trigger for my borderline symptoms, I'm not behaving rationally at all. And I've definitely said similar things to the example that you've used, and I've behaved in similar manners. Not necessarily sending things directly, but posting things online that I know that they'll see, that are, disturbing and things like that. So thank you for sharing, because I know it doesn't feel good to admit to these things, but we weren't well, and we can recognize now that is not the best way to deal with a breakup. But it's hard for people with BPD. Breakups are a big trigger.
Yeah, I mean, that fear of abandonment really gets activated. And it's funny because like now I'm talking about it in a very clear-minded way, and it might give the impression that I was intentionally manipulative at the time. But all of these things, like wanting to be immortalized in my ex's mind, like I wasn't consciously aware of that at the time. The only thing that was going through my mind at the time was that I felt so emotionally in pain that I was gonna die. And I just needed to do anything I could to get out of that emotional pain. And it's only in hindsight that I'm able to recognize some of those subconscious motivations. It is very hard when you're that intensely overcome with emotion to have a clarity about what's any other motivations that may be in your mind. It's just all pain all the time. What can I do to not feel like this?
That's a really good point. Yeah, definitely.
I'm glad you've said that, because I think sometimes when we're speaking on this podcast, we're in our wise mind, right? And we're talking about things in the past, and we are sitting here talking so reasonably about things that are really like completely unreasonable. And I'd like that you kind of put that caveat there that, at the time we couldn't have had a conversation like this at all. And I want to thank you for sharing, Xannie, and to commiserate with you. During my divorce, that was actually something that I threatened my ex with. I said that I was going to kill myself and I was going to film it and I was going to make him watch. I was going to like FaceTime him or whatever and make him watch it happening. Obviously, at the time, I was in, like you said, like pain and just all this. It was not thinking clearly. And looking back now, I can imagine somebody who I loved, even in the process of a divorce or a breakup, saying something like that, and how horrific that must have been to hear. And so you're not alone at all. I didn't actually do that, but I said it more than once. I wanted him to feel the pain that I felt and know that he was causing this pain, and that almost like maybe then he'll stop. Like maybe I could somehow stop it. But again, these are like after the fact thinking through, not in the moment. In the moment, I just wanted to die.
We've kind of touched on like this a little bit, but I'm curious if you had to think of specific traits or symptoms of BPD, how does that intersect with this concept of revenge and vindictiveness?
I think for me, I relate the fear of abandonment and the self destructive, impulsive behaviors with this sort of sense of revenge, because I think the fear of abandonment is often, particularly in rejection situations and breakups, what triggers those feelings for me. And the impulsivity definitely in my execution of whatever action I think will hurt the other person in that scenario. Because definitely on reflection, if I'd just taken a little bit of time to calm down, I probably wouldn't have behaved in the same way.
Yeah, the impulsivity is a big one for me too, I think. And it's odd because if I think back, I really wasn't able to think very clearly. And yet, the thoughts of what I could do that would hurt the other person the most were crystal clear. You know, it was
Mm.
like that was the only thing that I could see. Everything else was just mud. I think that's one of the reasons why it took me a long time to think that I could get better, because it's hard to recognize that in yourself and not just feel like you are the devil incarnate. Like in a moment of strife, the only thing that I can think about is how best to hurt you. You know, it's just like
Yeah.
it's so hard to build a sense of self-worth after you notice those things in yourself.
Mm. Yeah, the impulsivity is very the impulsivity, that's why like I kind of said it jokingly earlier, but I'm serious. Like I don't own weapons. I when I was very, very sick, I knew how I would end my life. And I had to make a conscious choice to not have any of those items around as part of my safety plan, because them being in the house, it was it was just too dangerous. And that's part of learning, understanding that you have that impulsivity. And then a strategy, like an effective strategy, is like, how much space can I put in between the impulsive thought and that wanting to take action and then actually doing it? And it has to be a big space.
Yeah. What would your advice be to anyone struggling with BPD who is currently really in the thick of dealing with urges for revenge or vindictive behavior?
I think my advice echoes what has worked well for me, which is just trying to take a pause. And I know when I was struggling, it was hard to be aware enough to catch myself to do the pause. But if you can, just take a break. Just sleep on it, walk away from the person, whatever it happens to be, to get a little distance. And the other thing I think for me, that I've learned to do more of, and I think would have helped me when I was more unwell, is instead of trying to think about what you wanna do to someone else, or the way you want to get revenge, whether that be hurting yourself or hurting someone else, is thinking about, actually, well, I'm hurting. I should be taking care of me. What would you do if you were little you, or you had your daughter, your son, if they were hurting? You'd want to comfort them. So that's something I've really tried hard to do, and that's been a big journey for me for a long time because I've struggled with self-harm and blaming myself, and the toxic shame is actually deserving or not, worthiness of not or not, because I think that's what I used to struggle with when I was unwell. I don't deserve to be cared for, self-care, blah, blah, blah. I think, don't think about it like that. Just think, like, if you were bleeding from your leg, you need to stick a plaster on it, right? You're not going to go after whatever cut you and hurt that. If it was let's say it was an animal, you're not going to hurt the animal because they cut you. You're going to deal with the issue that's at hand. So deal with the hurt, self-soothe, whatever self-soothe works for you. For me, it's soft things, making myself warm and comfortable, that sort of creating a cozy environment. For me, that's my best self-care. And so I'm trying to focus on doing that rather than lashing out. And I think that's probably what I would say to someone who is really struggling.
When you were talking about, like, you tend to yourself first, I was like, no, first I'd get that animal. But no, I should probably better to do it your way. What would I say to somebody who is struggling with these thoughts? First of all, you're not alone, because I feel like these can be very lonely thoughts. You're not alone. And just kind of telling yourself, like, this is recognizing it, like, I'm struggling with this thought. This is just a thought I'm having. I don't have to act on it. And something that's been really powerful for me is reminding myself to not ruminate. So one of the things I learned was that if you don't feed an emotion passes by in a set, pretty set amount of time. I think my therapist has said like 7 minutes, right? And I think before I would ruminate, I would feed it by thinking about it and thinking about it and thinking about it. And now I know that I need to think about it a little bit, like give myself a little bit of space, but then distract myself and do something else and think about something else, whatever it is, so that I don't feed that. And then the strong emotion, if it's not fed, will pass by. And then I have an easier time of getting into like wise mind and thinking about it, and then proceeding with like self-care, tending to myself. But the biggest thing I think that is most helpful is to remind myself that if you don't feed something, it dies, it goes away. And that can help for me, it helps stop those feelings. Because I could go with something all day. I mean, I could fantasize my revenge fantasies and my vindictiveness all day because I kept giving it food.
This is going to sound a little bit backwards in the sense that, like, when especially if you've acted on some of these feelings, it may feel like you need to tend to the other person. But this is sort of in line with what Celine was saying, which is that a lot of us will end up having, guilt or shame feelings of worthlessness that make it almost impossible for us to helpfully attend to the people that we've hurt. Like, I can say, at least in my case, that because I didn't attend to my own feelings, when the other person was like, ouch, you hurt me, my reaction was to be further defensive. Like, well, you deserve this. And I think a big part of recovery in general is learning to soothe ourselves and be our own supports so that we can then come out of ourselves to make amends, to, do whatever we have to do to take ownership for our part in a situation. It's really hard to do that if you are actively hating yourself and in a shame spiral and feeling like, as Melanie would say, a bag of balls. So I think having self-compassion and radically accepting wherever you are, like, this is how it is, take the judgment out of it, let me attend to my feelings so that I can come back and try to make whatever repair is necessary.
One of the most powerful experiences I had in recovery was when I was very, very upset. I was weeping. I was actually in the shower. I sat on the shower floor And I was crying and crying, and I ended up hugging myself up into a ball. And I kind of dissociated a little bit and came to myself and started like hugging myself, comforting myself, and telling myself, I am so sorry that this happened to you. I love you. I was talking to myself as if I was a child being comforted. And it was so powerful to feel like myself comforting myself. And I highly recommend if you can try that. Just treat, like Celine said, like mothering yourself, parenting yourself, loving yourself, and letting yourself do that. And I was talking out loud to myself. I probably looked insane if somebody saw it, but I was talking out loud to myself. I was letting the inner me weep and be so upset, but I was comforting myself at the same time.
Yeah, talking out loud to yourself is something that I recommend in those moments.
And actually talking out loud to yourself, but also one of the other things that I found is journaling it in some way, either physically writing out what I want to do to that person or all of that, physically writing that stuff out, typing it, whatever it is. There almost needs to be a physical manifestation of those thoughts and feelings in order to clear them out of your mind and get over them. Like, you don't want the physical manifestation to be throwing a brick through somebody's window, but some sort of you have to get that out of your head by verbalizing it. Or what I find really powerful is, like, verbalizing is using your mouth, but the using your hands in some way.
Or rage running.
Rage running, yes. Like,
Thank you, everyone, so much for watching. We hope you got a nugget of wisdom to take with you on your journey. Friday, we'll be back to talk about some of the constructive alternatives we've used to getting revenge or getting even. Join us on Sunday for our BPD Bunch brunch. And next Wednesday, we will be back with a brand new discussion topic. If you can't wait until then, please consider supporting our top 2 tiers on Patreon. Our BPD buddies and BPD besties get early access to extended cuts of our Wednesday discussion episodes a week in advance. So next week's episode is available right now on Patreon. You can check it out in the link down below, and we'll see you next time.